In this video, we look back at an infamous clash between three different firms during a match between Swansea and Crystal Palace at Cardiff's Ninian Park back in 1980. In a slightly different style video, we have the stories from three different perspectives. Let's hear the stories. Cardiff fan Terry told us. The game was played on a Monday night, January 14th, 1980, at Ninian Park. Swansea City v Crystal Palace, FA Cup third round, second replay, Ninian Park being deemed a neutral ground to play the tie. Cardiff City had played an FA Cup tie at home to the mighty Arsenal only 9 days before, which drew a crowd of 21,972, myself also being in that crowd. So even though this particular game was estimated to have drawn a crowd of about 23,000, believe me when I say that I thought there were more like 30,000 that night, the vast majority coming from Swansea, but also a big Palace following, and of course a few thousand Cardiff City fans as well. We went on the Bob Bank, where they had put the jacks, walked in behind a lad I'd seen down the city many times, and I kid you not, he must have sparked out a dozen jacks as he walked through them. Found out later it was a lad called Rudy Picker, who was a well-known boxer, who sadly took his own life some years later. He apparently beat Frank Bruno as an amateur fighter. Swansea fans took over the Bob Bank, with the Cardiff fans forced at the back and to the left of the Canton end of the Bob Bank. The Palace fans were concentrated in the open-ended Grange end, where the away fans went in those days. The grandstand and Canton end was, from what I recall, mixed. After the fighting, the Jacks had 3/4 of the Bob Bank at the start of the game and 1/4 at the end of it. All I can say about events that evening is that before, during, and especially after the game, there was just trouble and violence, mainly outside NP and around the Canton and Riverside areas, especially down Ninian Park Road, where the vast majority of fans would have to walk to and from Central train station. It was down Ninian Park Road that Swansea fan was stabbed to death before the game, if I remember correctly. I remember walking back to the station with a load of Cardiff fans, and the old bill were everywhere. The situation was very intimidating, as no one really knew who was who, apart from the fellas in your group. Swansea won the game 2-1 in the end, I think. Was the game worth the life of a football supporter? I don't think so. I heard a few years later that the Palace fan convicted of the murdered was found hanging in his prison cell. The knife was found at the back of a yard on the corner of 112 Ninian Park Road, Wells Street. God, it was mental that night. Blood everywhere. The unfortunate Jack who got killed name was David Williams, and Barry Rondo was the Palace fan that murdered him. Yeah, I went up to the court to have a look at him. Kid didn't know how to stab. Swansea fan Will told us. The authorities who govern the game we all love have made their fair share of both mystifying and commendable decisions over the years. The creation of the Premier League and the introduction of 3 points for a win stand out as transformative milestones. However, during less polished eras of football, there were also some baffling decisions made by those in charge. As a long-time Swansea fan, one decision that still stands out was the choice to replay an FA Cup tie on neutral territory after 2 drawn matches against Crystal Palace. That was simply how things were back then. Penalties were considered a foreign and undesirable method of settling matches, so cup ties often dragged on until a winner emerged through open play. Looking back, it seems absurd that such practices were routine, but that was the reality. One particularly memorable occasion was when Swansea had to face Palace at the neutral ground of Ninian Park in Cardiff on a cold winter's night, all those years ago. At the time, I was a punk rock-driven, slightly left-field Swansea supporting skinhead who proudly stood on the North Bank with a clenched fist, defending our club. Our matchday rituals revolved around Northampton Lane and a pub called 4J's, where punk music blasted through the speakers, and the vibrant local scene brought together spiky tops and fans alike. It was a buzzing, electric atmosphere, especially on match days. The pub's location offered us quick access to the main drag, providing a swift route down to the Vetch Field. In 1980, I found it almost incomprehensible that the FAW would sanction such a decision by the FA to play the tie in Cardiff. Just 2 weeks earlier, New Year's Day had seen extreme violence between Swansea and Cardiff fans after a 2-1 victory for the Swans at the Vetch. Offering both sets of hooligans another chance to clash seemed reckless and absurd. The initial FA Cup game against Palace ended in a 2-2 draw at Swansea, followed by a thrilling 3-3 replay at Selhurst Park, where David Giles shone for the Swans against a club he would later represent in nearly 100 games. The stage was set for a high-stakes replay, and we travelled east, first from Haverfordwest to Swansea, and then by train into Cardiff. The trains were packed with Swansea supporters, from Pembrokeshire and beyond, crammed into standing-room-only compartments as they rattled toward a night that would alter lives forever, and tragically end one completely. It's hard to comprehend now the mindset of a 16-year-old kid at the time. We had endured years of governmental upheaval, strikes, cultural clashes, and societal conflict. Music was a unifying force, smashing down barriers across the UK, and British bands were profoundly influencing personal and political spheres. As a devoted North banker, I approached the Cardiff trip with trepidation, knowing full well the animosity that had erupted only weeks before. The palpable hatred that filled the cold Cardiff night was unlike anything else. The Swansea-Cardiff rivalry was still relatively new, but the intensity was overwhelming. Adrenaline surged as thousands of Swans fans poured from the main station toward Ninian Park. Skirmishes broke out in the streets, sirens wailed, and punches flew between the rival factions. Reflecting on it now, the animosity seems irrational. Many intelligent people have tried to explain the roots of such rivalries, but their arguments often fall flat. Football culture defies easy explanation, and this kind of blind tribalism simply happens, fueled by emotions rather than reason. That night, Ninian Park hosted an officially recorded crowd of just under 24,000. Reports suggested that nearly 19,000 were Swansea supporters, a phenomenal away following. Palace brought their own contingent, and locals from Cardiff added another combustible element to the mix. Swansea fans dominated the Bob Bank and other sections of the ground as the Swans secured a thrilling 2-1 victory in a cauldron of raw football passion and unfiltered hatred. Hatred at a football match. Before, during and after the game, clashes erupted between Swansea, Cardiff and Palace supporters. Palace fans, for the most part, sought to get home safely, but some escalated the violence to devastating levels. Outside the ground, tragedy struck. Swansea supporter David Williams was fatally stabbed by a Palace fan, Barry Rondo, who was just 20 years old. Another fan survived a knife attack. 10 months later, Rondo was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. A decade later, he took his own life at HMP Long Lartin. His name surfaced again in a book glorifying criminals, which tastelessly claimed he was a friend of Charles Bronson. This tragic episode often lingers in my mind when Swansea plays Crystal Palace. It's a stark reminder that football, like anything else in life, is never worth a human life. The senseless killing of another person over a football rivalry is utterly unjustifiable. For today's fans, it's vital to understand and respect our club's history, not to glorify the violence, but to learn from it and ensure that such tragedies are never repeated. And finally, Crystal Palace fan Alan told us, "It was carnage from start to finish. I went on the football special, and on arriving at Cardiff Central, the announcer told everyone to duck their heads as we would be entering bricking area, where the Cardiff locals would be waiting to brick the train. Sure enough, quite a few people got injured from broken glass, and that's before we left the train. The walk to the ground was incredible, with running battles taking place, some between Palace and Swansea, some between Swansea and Cardiff, and even Palace and Cardiff. It was like some chaotic Wild West with hardly any police. At some point, a Swansea fan got stabbed to death by a Palace fan, who apparently jumped out of a minivan and attacked the Swansea lads. I heard that the Palace fan later killed himself in prison, which makes you question the whole era, really. Getting killed at a footy match is simply horrific. Anyway, we gets to the ground and we enter the stadium, and it's mixed between the three sets of fans. I think we were on the Bob Bank, but it's a bit of a guess as I was so intent on surviving the madness going on around me, I forgot I was at a football match. It was keep your head down and your mouth shut. Eventually, the police started to gain some control, but fighting continued. There must have been 20,000 Swansea there that night, with about 3,000 Palace and 3,000 Cardiff. The official 24,000 attendance was completely out. No way. More like 30,000. I think the trouble was caused by Cardiff getting into the Grange end and trying to take their end back. And it was vicious fighting at times, with just a few coppers trying to quell it. Madness. After the game, it was more carnage, with massive groups of jacks chasing anyone and everyone down the road, that long road back to Cardiff Central. We kept our heads down and got to the station in complete silence, as we could see other Palace fans getting picked off by Jacks or Cardiff. I was slightly confused as to who was who, but they were all Welsh. That's something I do know. Somehow got back to trains and back home safely, but it was simply horrendous. Whoever thought it a good idea to play the match in Cardiff needs locking up and the key thrown away. Someone died, and that can't be right. I'll always remember the match, but for all the wrong reasons. And we lost. Nuff said. We thank Terry, Will and Alan for their recollections of what was a tragic night. We condone all acts of violence, but we must report on horrific events like these, so has to stop them from happening again. Thanks for watching. Now please share, like and subscribe, as it really helps our channel grow.